20 Instructional Designer Interview Questions and Answers. Instructional design is the process by which learning designs are developed and delivered systematically. The instructional design should successfully transfer skills and knowledge to individuals. Thus, an instructional designer develops educational experiences to maximize learner success. They make sure that learners have the tools and materials needed to easily understand, comprehend, and achieve a learning outcome. Good quality learning materials highly depend on instructional designers. This implies that you need to hire a qualified and experienced person for this role. Use these top 20 instructional designer interview questions and answers to find the best candidate. 1. Tell us about yourself and why you are interested in this position. The interviewer seeks to hear a summed-up version of you and why you want this job. Tip number 1. Describe who you are and explain why you want the job. Tip number 2. State some skills or qualities that you possess concerning instructional design. Sample answer. I am a self-driven, hard-working, and very ambitious individual. I hold a bachelor's degree in instructional design. In the past 6 years, I have acquired a lot of skills in instructional design and training trainers. Also, I have good organizational and communication skills. Further, I can produce outstanding results. I am confident that my skills will align with this role and my experience will be of great use to the company. 2. What are the roles of an instructional designer? The interviewer seeks to know whether you are familiar with the roles performed by instructional designers. Tip number 1. State several roles performed by instructional designers. Tip number 2. Provide the impression that you know your roles. Sample answer. Instructional designers play a very important role in creating e-learning experiences that learners love. They are the building blocks of designing instructional materials for an e-learning course. Besides, they collaborate with subject matter experts to create these e-learning materials. They also make sure to provide the tools and materials that learners need to achieve their learning goals. 3. How do you teach instructors about using an e-learning platform? The interviewer wants to get an idea of your technical prowess and the ability to work well with others. Tip number 1. Talk about how you approach teaching as a teacher. Tip number 2. Show that you know how to train. Sample answer. To train a teacher, I use a specific instructional method, just like in my course design. I have instructional videos and writing guides. Sometimes I work with the instructor, especially if the instructor is a newbie on the basics of the platform. I always make sure that the instructor learns how to use the e-learning platform successfully. 4. How do you make your course materials engaging? The interviewer is interested in how you get creative with your course design to keep your students interested in the material. They want to hear your experience in leveraging multimedia elements in your courses. Tip number 1. State how you develop engaging content. Tip number 2. Provide a clear and complete answer. Sample answer. I ensure to use scenarios that are familiar and understandable to learners. This makes it easy for them to connect with learning contexts and gain understanding. I also use examples to explain points further, and practical guides that learners can use to practice. Besides, I create supporting media such as audio and videos. 5. Why should we hire you for this position? The interviewer wants to know if you are competent to handle the duties and responsibilities of the position. Tip number 1. Show that you are qualified for the position. Tip number 2. Demonstrate your understanding of the requirements as advertised. Sample answer. I understand that you need a person who has worked in this role for not less than 4 years. I have 6 years of experience as an instructional designer. I have successfully headed a team of 20 members through various projects and achieved great results. Therefore, I have the relevant skills and experience needed to perform this role expertly. 6. How will you handle conflict in your team? The interviewer wants to know if you have conflict management skills. He or she wants to find out if you can resolve team conflicts. Tip number 1. describe how you deal with conflicts. Tip number 2, prove that you can resolve team conflicts. Sample answer. I will first seek to understand the root cause of the disagreement. Then, I will use my expert skills to provide advice and direction to resolve the problem. Additionally, I will make sure that every team member understands how things should be done to avoid conflicts in the future. Also, I will remind them of our goals. Doing this will significantly reduce work-related conflicts. 7. What is your greatest achievement? The interviewer is seeking to find out your actual measurable performance and impact. Tip number 1, explain your most outstanding achievement. Tip number 2, be clear and to the point. Sample answer. In my last position as an instructional designer, my department achieved 96% success in developing instructional designs. This in-house survey sought to assess the achievements made in e-learning presentations. The feedback from instructors was positive. In the previous year, the department had scored 60%. Following this, I used various strategies to boost my team's morale and improve their performance. 8. What do you know about our organization? The interviewer wants to find out if research about the organization. The question also tests your level of preparedness. Tip number 1, mention what you know about the organization. Tip number 2, show that you have done some research about it. Sample answer. I know that you have remained at the top of the industry for several years. Your organization has a reputation for maintaining high learning standards. Also, you are very passionate about inclusivity and continuous growth. 9. How do you deal with underperformance? The interviewer wants to know what you will do if an employee is not meeting their targets. Tip number 1, state the approach you will use to deal with underperforming employees. Tip number 2, show your ability to tackle poor performance. Sample answer. As an instructional designer and leader of my team, one of my roles is coaching. First, I find out why an employee is performing poorly. The employee might be having issues that are not work-related, or it could be a lack of training. After finding out the problem, I will design an empowerment program, and implement it on the affected individuals. 10. How does a typical day of an instructional designer look like? This question is meant to test your understanding of the daily routine of an instructional designer. Tip number 1, state what instructional designers do every day. Tip number 2, prove your familiarity with this area. Sample answer. A typical day of an instructional designer involves designing compelling course content, and engaging learning activities, setting instructional end goals and developing learning content that matches them, and visualizing instructional graphs. He or she maintains course folders and project documentation, designs modes of assessment, and creates supporting learning media like simulations and videos. 11. How do you stay motivated at work? The interviewer seeks to know how you remain motivated at work. Tip number 1, describe what motivates you. Tip number 2, be sincere with your answer. Sample answer. I am motivated by the fact that the products I create are aimed at empowering learners. I get inspired to know that learners have been helped by the designs I create. Besides, the passion I have for what I do inspires me every day. 12. How do you ensure to deliver excellent results? This question tests your ability to deliver excellent results in instructional designs. Tip number 1, describe how you deliver outstanding outcomes. Tip number 2, prove that you deliver excellent results. Sample answer. I ensure to do all that it takes to provide the best service. I always encourage my team to aim at meeting targets and even exceed them whenever possible. My team and I have procedures that we follow to maintain consistency and set standards. Besides, I make sure that everyone in my team knows the expectations of the department. This way, we all work towards a common goal and in the end, we produce excellent results. 13. Can you be trusted with sensitive information? The interviewer wants to know if you can handle confidential information appropriately. Tip number 1, confirm that you can be trusted with sensitive information. Tip number 2, explain to support your answer. Sample answer. Yes. I implement available measures for limiting access to sensitive information. This includes refraining from sharing the information, locking drawers containing such information, locking my office when away or not in use, and securing my office computer with a password when away. 14. If change needs to be implemented in your profession, how would you go about it? Here, the questioner wants to assess your ability to implement change. Tip number 1, describe how you would implement change. Tip number 2, give the impression that you can implement change effectively. Sample answer. I would begin by communicating planned change to all parties to make them know how designs will be altered. I will then lead the change implementation process. Training would be done so that everyone knows how to use the new designs. After the change, I would conduct a review to ascertain that the change was effective and identify areas that should be revisited. 15. How do you make sure to communicate effectively? Communicating effectively is very important in the workplace. The interviewer wants to know whether you can convey information effectively. Tip number 1, demonstrate that you can communicate effectively. Tip number 2, mention the modes of communication you use. Sample answer. To make sure I communicate effectively, I choose my communication channels wisely. I consider the type of information that is involved and the people I want to reach. Then I can choose the appropriate channel, whether phone calls, memos, or email. I also work with team heads to make sure that the message is decoded correctly. 16. What characteristics should instructional designs have? This question tests your knowledge concerning the characteristics of instructional design. Tip number 1, name several characteristics of instructional designs. Tip number 2, show that you are well aware of these traits. Sample answer. Instructional designs are learner-centered, goal-oriented, and are focused on real-world performance. They are empirical, involve teamwork, and center on outcomes that can be assessed validly and reliably. 17. What is meant by instructional design model? The interviewer asks this question to test if you are familiar with the instructional design model. Tip number 1, define instructional design model. Tip number 2, state why it's used. Sample answer. An instructional design model is a framework or tool for developing instructional materials. Instructional designers use it to provide meaning and structure to learning materials. The tool helps them to visualize training needs and split the process of developing training materials. 18. Name some types of instructional design models. Your knowledge about instructional design models is tested using this question. Tip number 1, state at least 3 types of instructional design models. Tip number 2, prove that you are knowledgeable about these models. Sample answer. There are different kinds of instructional design models. These are CARE, Instructional Design System, ISD, Dick and Carey, Sam, Kemp, and ADDIE. Amongst all, the latter is the most commonly used. 19. Name the 5 stages involved in the ADDIE process. This question tests whether you know the ADDIE model and the steps involved. Tip number 1, state the steps involved in ADDIE. Tip number 2, demonstrate your understanding of this design model. Sample answer. The term ADDIE stands for 5 stages that are involved in this instructional design model. These are analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. 20. What failure have you experienced and how did you overcome it? No one is perfect no matter how experienced or qualified. The interviewer seeks to know a failure you experienced and whether you overcame it. Tip number 1, describe a failure you have faced in the past. Tip number 2, state how you overcame it. Sample answer. As I was getting started in the profession, I was tasked with designing learning materials for young learners. Unfortunately, they could not use them because the design was too complex for them to use and understand. I resolved this by revising the learning materials to suit the needs and level of young learners. Conclusion? These interview questions and answers cover different areas of the instructional design role. They also test personal and behavioral traits that can impact how an individual performs this role. Thus, they can be relied upon to identify the right candidate for this job.